What are we discussing on today's Locked on Diamondbacks podcast? Is this the most anticipation, the most pressure the D-backs have ever faced entering a season?
You are Locked on Diamondbacks, your daily Arizona Diamondbacks podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into the Locked on Diamondbacks podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. You're listening to who? Always charismatic host of this podcast, Millard Thomas. I'm a multimedia journalist and I'm a graphic designer, so please go check out my website, millardthomas24.myportfolio.com. On there you can see all my latest work, from my packages to my articles to my photos and my graphic design. Thank you for making Locked on Diamondbacks your first listen every day. I would not be able to do this podcast without you, my loyal listeners, sharing, subscribing, reviewing, doing all that so I could do this podcast for you. Thank you. It's free and available on all platforms, so please continue to tell your friends. And one of those platforms is YouTube, so please hit subscribe to Locked on Diamondbacks on YouTube. We're currently at 920 subscribers, I believe, so please hit subscribe, trying to crack 1,000 before opening day. And on today's podcast, we got part two with Javier Reyes of Locked on Padres discussing the most hated D-backs and Padres players, but that's only for the audio listeners. If you're watching this on YouTube, gotta go to the YouTube page, Locked on Diamondbacks, to see the full video. For the YouTube audience, you're only going to see me talk about, is this the most anticipated, most pressure-filled season the D-backs have ever had entering this year? We'll talk about that on today's podcast for both YouTube and audio listeners. But before we get into that, I first want to tell you guys that today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Now let's get into the Locked on Diamondbacks podcast, and let's answer the question. Is this the most anticipation, the most pressure the D-backs have ever faced entering a season? Because I do think there are a few other D-backs years that you could say, hey, that team had expectations actually entering the year. That team actually made moves in the offseason that would apply pressure to that squad entering that year. And 2023, or I guess now 2024 actually, is no different for the D-backs team entering this year, because they made moves this offseason. They're coming off a World Series appearance. So there's a lot of pressure and anticipation for the D-backs entering 2024. But is it the most they ever face? That's the question I want to ask, because I do think there are a few other seasons that are very comparable to the feelings that we have for this D-back squad entering this year. The last time I felt like I had any sort of expectations for the D-backs was 2020. Now, I think there's a lot more pressure and anticipation for the 2024 D-backs as opposed to 2020, but they're on the list. The 2020 season, entering that season, I should say, of course, the COVID-shortened year. D-backs in 2019 coming off 85 wins the previous year. In that 2020 offseason, you had signed Madison Bumgarner to that, really big contract, which actually at the time wasn't that bad of a deal. Again, 5 for 85 for what we thought Mad Bum still was. That's an elite price considering Erod just got 4 for 20. I think Mad Bum 5 for 85 made sense at the time. Ended up being an awful contract. D-backs also acquired Starling Marte and Cole Calhoun. It was the second year of Carson Kelly and Luke Weaver. I just think there was a lot of upside for the D-backs entering the 2020 season. Maybe you didn't have World Series expectations like you might have now for the D-backs, but you were like, okay, this D-backs team coming off 85 wins, looked good in the second half of 2019. I expect this team to get better entering 2020. I expect this team to be fully improved, and they instead took a step backwards in a big way. Again, 2020 is a season that I put with a grain of salt. I put an asterisk on it in terms of performances from players and teams. But the D-backs failed all expectations in 2020, had an awful year. 2016, another year where I think the D-backs had expectations entering the year. It looks like the D-backs were ready to take a step forward after winning 79 games in 2015. They had just signed, of course, Zach Greinke to the biggest contract in their franchise history, gave him over $200 million. The D-backs also did something wild in 2016 by trading the number one pick for Shelby Miller. They traded for Gene Segura this year. year two of Robbie Ray and Yasmani Tomas and Brandon Drury. Like there were just a lot of expectations for the D-backs entering 2016 after that big contract, after some massive trades. The D-backs definitely want to compete in 2016, make a run at the NL West title potentially, and instead they were not able to do that, and they lost 69 games, actually winning 10 less games than the previous year. And Zach Greinke did not look good in his first year as an Arizona Diamondback. 2016 is the second year on my list. The third year on my list, the 2008 season. D-backs in 07 was coming off a 90-win year, so they were pretty good the previous year, and it felt like the D-backs want to get better in 2008. They traded for Dan Herron to make a big three of Brandon Webb, Dan Herron, and Randy Johnson on the last legs of his career. You had the debut of Justin Upton. I don't think the D-backs expected to win the World Series or anything like that in 2008, but I think they wanted their team to at least get to the postseason, be a wild card team, and instead they won 8 less games in 2008, barely above 500, and they ended up missing the postseason and not meeting any expectations. And then the final year that I have on my list of seasons that I think the D-backs entered with anticipation and pressure, the 2001 season. Of course, the D-backs capitalized in 2001, right? They won the World Series, knocked off the New York Yankees in 9-11. And in 2001, they were coming off 85 wins the previous year in 2000. And of course, in 1999, they won 100 games. So the D-backs were entering 01 with something to prove. They had traded for Curt Schilling the previous year. They signed guys like Mark Grace and Reggie Sanders and Miguel Batista to help out the squad. And in the end, everything clicked for the Arizona Diamondbacks. Johnson was elite, of course, Curt Schilling, and we know the rest is history. Now, you could say maybe 02, 03 were two other seasons that had some anticipation, but I thought those were honestly the four biggest seasons. I'm just looking through it that had the most anticipation, had the most pressure for the D-backs entering the year. But even with that being said, I don't think any of those years had as much pressure and anticipation, as I keep saying, as the D-backs have entering 2024. I think it's really because of two big reasons. The first one is unfinished business for this D-backs team. There's so much anxiety surrounding this D-backs team, so much, but positive anxiety, more anxiousness, because we saw this D-backs team be ahead of schedule last year. This was supposed to be another year rebuilding this past season, and instead, the D-backs were a postseason team. The D-backs were one of the best teams in the first half of Major League Baseball. This was a team that made it all the way to the World Series. So the fact that we saw a squad that we didn't have total faith, total belief in, a squad that we felt like was still incomplete, the fact that we saw that team get all the way to the World Series, of course, we're going to have more anticipation entering 2024, because it's like, if we did improve our team in the offseason, then how could we not expect a better run potentially in the postseason this year? We saw what the ceiling of this team is, and that was before we even fixed our holes, plugged up our holes. That was before any additions this offseason. So if this D-backs team was already making it to the World Series when we still felt like they were incomplete, and the fact that they didn't win it just adds a chip to the shoulder of every guy, every manager, and everybody in that front office. So I think the D-backs are playing with a different fire in their belly. Then the number two reason, this is arguably the strongest team on paper the D-backs have ever had. When you look at this team from top to bottom, you could compare them to any team in their franchise history, and this might be the best D-backs team ever. The rotation is as deep as any in franchise history. Curt Schilling, Randy Johnson, those guys are better than a Zach Gallen and a Merrill Kelly, but pound for pound, those guys are really good. Now you add in Erod. Now you got Brandon Pfaadt as well. Like, you got yourself a 1-4 in the rotation that you have not had in a very long time. This is probably the best D-backs 1-4 ever. And so you look at the rotation, strong, stacked, depth. You look at the lineup, as well balanced a lineup the D-backs have ever had. The D-backs have had really good lineups in their past, but have they ever had lineups that go 7 deep? And it doesn't matter if there's a righty or lefty on the mound. Like, they actually have dudes that can crush both sides of the plate. They actually looks like they're going to be adding a righty DH so they can really be good in any type of scenario. Ketel Marte, one of the best second basemen in baseball. Christian Walker, elite defensive first baseman, power hitter. Suarez got the power. Gurriel, overall well-balanced player. Corbin Carroll's a superstar. Gabriel Moreno, one of the best offensive catchers in Major League Baseball, and the D-backs have always had themselves a really good offensive catcher when you look at their franchise history. So I feel good about that. The pen is solid. We got Paul Sewald finally, a closer. Kevin Ginkel, one of the best setup men in baseball, and the D-backs year after year put a good defense on the field. I feel like this D-backs team, one of the reasons why we love it so much is because the players on this team feel like D-backs. This is not like a Lakers or a Dodgers situation where a lot of those guys are just signed from other rosters, right? Like, the Dodgers roster is elite, but Mookie Betts comes from the Red Sox, and Freddie Freeman spent 15 years with the Atlanta Braves, right? And you bring in the Jason Haywards and the David Peraltas, and you bring in the Tyler Glasnows and the Yamamotos. Like, none of those Dodgers, despite them actually developing players at a pretty high rate and developing them to be pretty good major leaguers, a lot of the best Dodgers are dudes from other teams. The best D-backs players feel homegrown. Zach Gallen was traded from the Miami Marlins. He's been with the D-backs since day one of his major league career, right? Corbin Carroll and even the Martes, who we also traded for. Like, all these guys made a name for themselves on the Arizona Diamondbacks. And I think that's the difference between guys that we trade for versus guys that the Dodgers trade for. The Dodgers trade for already proven guys. We trade for youngsters who have to prove themselves on the D-backs. So I think there's another level of fandom when it feels like you're dudes on the team as opposed to just signing merchants and assassins on the free agent market. So everyone wants to see this D-backs team get back to the postseason this year, and I think they will. I'm predicting 87 to 88 wins in a wild card. And then after that, anything is possible. But I think this is definitely the most anticipated and most stressful season that the D-backs have ever faced.